and you're very welcome back to another episode of History Now. I'm delighted to be joined all the way from Canada today by historian and author Jesse Thistle. Jesse has a new book out called From the Ashes, My Story of Being Métis, Homelessness and Finding My Way. Jesse is here to talk about his life and his history, the history of his people, and how history can help combat transgenerational trauma. So Jesse, you're very welcome to the show. It's my absolute pleasure to have you on. Your book, From the Ashes, it's been getting rave reviews right across the world, I think, and congratulations on that. Can you tell me at what point why you thought, you know what, I'm going to write my story?
The way that I came to be an author is kind of strange. So I won all these academic awards in a way that nobody had ever done at York University, and the reporters all came to do a story on that. And in it, the guy realized that, I'm pretty old to be doing my my PhD, and he asked me about my backstory, and I told him that really my rise into higher education starts when I rob a 7-Eleven in Brampton in an effort to save my leg, which was severely infected. And that's where my education started. And so he put the story out, and it came out, and um, attracted major attention from publishing houses that were interested in writing my story. And so I'm an accidental author. I'm just a historian, trying to get my doctorate. And this kind of happened by accident. So it's a beautiful accident, but an accident nonetheless.
This story, it's a fascinating story. It's a tragic story, but it's one full of hope as well. Can you give us a bit of background on yourself and your family?
Sure. Yeah. My family are the rebel Métis-Cree who stood up against British imperialism in the late 19th century as they were taking over our homelands in the West. Part of that was that they stole our lands and pushed us onto the sides of the roads and railways in these spaces called road allowances. And here we squatted without any government protection all the way from my ancestors' time right up until my childhood. And it's a history that Canada is not too proud of, and they've done their best to suppress and hide. Why this is important for my life is that theft, that total marginalization created really severe historic intergenerational trauma within the Métis. And my life, as I experienced it, homelessness, addiction, is really an expression of what happened to my people over time when they stood up for themselves. And so in that way, it's a really kind of deep dive into the effects of transgenerational trauma on Indigenous peoples in Canada.
Yeah, and you are Indigenous Canadian on both sides of your family, is that right?
Yeah, I got it. I got Métis-Cree on my mom's side. These are the rebels. And then on my dad's side, they were like the elites, Scottish mixed with Cree, and they were the ones who were the chief factors, running the forts along the Hudson's Bay. And they came from the ancestral roots are in Orkney in the north of Scotland. That's where they got those guys. So the only ones tough enough to work in northern Canada.
Yeah, probably it's as cold in the Orkneys as it does get in Canada. So if we could talk about your childhood, because there's something that you've mentioned in previous articles that I've read, and that is something called the Sixties Scoop. Could you tell us what that is and how that relates to your own personal experience?
Yeah, so here in Canada, there was this sociological phenomenon called the 60s Scoop that started really in the late 50s and continued all the way through till the mid 80s. And what this was state agencies would go into Indigenous homes that they deemed were derelict of their duty as parents, or were unhygienic, or didn't have the resources to raise their children, and they took them with the justification that they could find a better home. And what they did is they placed them in respectable white homes, people that were mainly middle-class homeowners, mainly in urban settings, so far away from the north, where they scooped the kids. And in this way, generations of Indigenous youth were taken and placed elsewhere. And what that did ultimately is it created severe cultural dislocation. So when natives like me were raised elsewhere, we were not taught what it was to be a Métis or Cree person. We weren't taught our history. We're just supposed to kind of get along in life without knowing who we were. And that itself was very damaging, and created almost, I theorize, a kind of homelessness, a cultural homelessness for generations of Indigenous peoples. And I know it sounds like this is something in the past, but these rates of scooping are actually, I think, higher now than they were back when I was. So it's continued. It hasn't slowed down over time.
That led to the breakup of your family. You've a couple of brothers as well. So where did you end up? And then I know that you went back to live with your grandmother. So could we talk about, that displacement and then coming back into your family?
Sure. So my mom and dad had a tumultuous relationship. My mom being the native woman, and my dad being kind of he was a quarter Algonquin, but he knew himself as a white dude. But he had a lot of addiction issues and abuse issues himself, and they broke up. She tried to start a new life, and she was just a young woman trying to get start her life working and trying to take care of three little toddlers, basically. And she was tired, and he showed up one day. He looked like he was sober for a period of time, and she let him let him take us. He said he was going to take us back to Toronto, and on the way, he kept leaving us alone in apartments. He wasn't supplying us with food. He was going out looking for drugs, and it was noticed by one of the neighbors that we were doing this, that he was doing that. And they came and they got us. And that's how we ended up in state care. And instead of phoning my mom, which is what they should have done, really, uh, they phoned my white grandparents. And it's all related to the scoop thing that we're talking about. And so in this way, we were taken out of our Indigenous community and culture and raised in suburban Brampton as white kids, and but like the other white kids knew we weren't 100% white, and we got a lot of fights. And my brother Josh foolishly told everybody we lived in a teepee. I got to tell you, there's no other way to get beat up faster in grade school in Canada than to tell other kids that. And so we were raised by my white grandparents in Brampton, and my grandfather was a Cape Britainer. This is like a really, really rough type of Canadian, Scottish guy. And he did his best to raise us as best he could, but his heart was broken because my father went missing in 1982. And so my grandparents in a lot of ways were broken themselves. And so through this, now looking back, I can really see clearly that the transgenerational trauma was not only on my native side, it also came down from my Scottish and Algonquin ancestors too, and converged in my life and really affected my family on both sides.
And of course, you've come to terms with this, you've come to realize that the effects of transgenerational trauma. But can we talk about when you were there at your grandparents and how whatever way we can say this is, your life took a downturn? And
Oh,
could you
yeah.
explain what those experiences were and where that led you?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up, my grandparents, he was a disciplinarian. So he believed in a good spanking once in a while, and he believed in hard work. And it was a tough environment, and those old guys back then, that's how they were. He was just doing what he knew. And I understand that. But, as a kid growing up in the 80s, I was interpreting that he didn't love me or they didn't love me. And I was already culturally dislocated, having to fight all the time in school. And so I grew very insecure and resentful of my Indigenous heritage. My mom wasn't around. I felt like she ditched us. So I was resentful to her. And by age 15, my early teen years, I started experimenting with drugs. And, I started small with acid and speed and all the, primer drugs at marijuana. And then I quickly graduated because I had this trauma. They say that the gateway drug is trauma. It's not marijuana. And so I was primed for addiction, and I joined a gang called the Bud Boys because that gave me a sense of belonging and family. And we started going to raves. I don't know if you guys have those over in Ireland the same way we did, but back in my generation, this is what we did. We went and listened to ragga music and jungle music and house music. And I just lost myself in that for many years. And part of living at my grandparents' house, was they never believed in drugs, and they said if they ever caught me with drugs, that they would kick me out. And they meant what they said. I got caught with a bag of coke after one night and kicked me out, and so began my homeless career. And so, yeah, it's really kind of a tragic tale of the effects of trauma and addiction, and then converging in with my grandparents who kicked me out. So.
And as you mentioned there, and you mentioned at the beginning of the interview, you were homeless for many years, and you've been in prison.
Yeah.
Can we talk a bit about that? And then what you mentioned at the beginning, this sort of a revelation, I don't know if it was a revelation or not, but this moment where you went from taking these negative experiences and going back to education.
Sure. Yeah. I became homeless first in 1997 after I was kicked out by my grandparents, and then my brother, who was a cop in Vancouver, and he told me not to use drugs in his apartment, and I did that because I was an addict, and that's what addicts do. And so my homelessness, they call it cyclical homelessness. So I'd end up in a shelter, this emergency housing for homeless people, and then I'd get my government check to move into a room or an apartment. I'd move in, use drugs until the money was gone, and then jump out the window on the first when the rent was due to avoid the landlord. Then I'd end up sleeping, subways, outside. I stayed at the top of the building staircases, and I did this for many years. This cycle, just going around, staying on my relatives' couches here and there. And my what really ended that for me was a severe injury that I had. I fell off a building that got really, really infected, and I felt in my mind that I wasn't getting the proper care that I needed, and I knew in jail I could get that. And so I went and I robbed a store in an effort to save my leg. And in this way, I came on the radar of the state. They're like, oh, here's a guy who's suffering from addictions and he can't get into treatment, and maybe we have to rezone him and help him out. And so in that way, the state started to actually take care of me and offer me programming. I tried to get into rehab many times before that, but they'd all had long waiting lists and whatnot because they didn't have work insurance because I was homeless. And so in this way, I had to use my agency to catch state attention. But ultimately, inside is where I got kind of sick and tired of the life that I was living. You got to think I was living like this for like 10 years. And at the end of it, I was like, I saw a guy at the end of the range. This is where we do time. And I noticed that he didn't get any fights. He didn't trade chocolate bars. He didn't cause no trouble. He just sat there in his books. And I thought, hey, maybe I can change my life and be like that guy. And so I went and I talked to him. And in our conversation, he let it be known that you could get your high school through the chaplaincy, through the Salvation Army, guy that helps out the prisoners. And so I started doing that. And with help from the other inmates, I retaught myself how to read and write. I was functionally literate at this time, so I could read at the very basic level. But not a very complex reading. And so I worked at it and I got my credits there, and I still got in trouble after that. I still went back and forth, but eventually I got to a rehab in Ottawa after another crime, and I served my year there, and I got clean and sober, and that was my pathway into my new addiction. I replaced my crack addiction with my addiction for history, my addiction for education. And in that way, I'm kind of obsessive with history. And from that came all of my awards and everything I'm doing now.
So from, getting back into education, what pointed you in the direction of history?
Great question. So part of my homelessness was really about cultural dislocation. I didn't know who I was as a Métis-Cree person because of the adoption, hey? And so I knew that the keys to my long-term sobriety had something to do with me figuring myself out. I wanted to figure out why I was the way I was and why I saw so many other indigenous peoples out on the streets and in, the justice system in the courts. And I started taking indigenous history classes. And in that, I ran into a woman named Dr. Victoria Freeman, who had as one of her assignments, she asked the students to situate themselves within Canadian colonization. So why are your family here? How did you get here? What's your family history and whatnot? And so when she asked this of me, I didn't know anything. And so I phoned back to my aunties in Saskatchewan, my auntie Vaughn, and I asked her, "Hey, I'm doing this assignment. Who am I?" And she gave me a link to ancestry.com. I'm sure you guys have that over there. And in that, I could see, hey, look, I come from these proud Catholic rebels that stood up against British and Protestant imperialism in the 19th century and fought for their rights. And I should be proud of who I am as a mixed-blooded Métis person. I shouldn't believe what the public history is telling me about Métis or indigenous peoples. We're not all drunks. We're not all criminals. We're not all these bad things. So I handed in the paper, and I got a 91. And I detailed my family history and how I ended up in Toronto. And she's like, this is a very important paper. I want to kick it up to another historian who's actually an expert in Métis history. And so that's what she did. And I met this woman named Dr. Carolyn Podruchny. And she looked at my family history and she knew exactly who my clans were. We live in clans, Métis people, the Morissettes, the Arcans. These are very powerful bison hunting clans, very wealthy middlemen. And she's like, I know that you're disconnected from your mom and your people. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fly you back to Saskatchewan, and we're going to visit all these battle sites where your family fought against Canada. And we're going to talk to elders, and your mom and your auntie can come with you. And so that's what we did. All that year, we drove around all through Saskatchewan talking to elders, and we're recollecting almost this meta narrative of the Métis that was lost within my family. And through that, I reconnected with my mom, and I reconnected with my aunties and my uncles, and I really got to know who I was. And so, knowing your family history is like a navigation tool towards the future. It gives you purpose, you know who you are and how you're situated in today. And so it was the most beautiful, life-changing thing that I've ever been a part of, was through this historical reclamation of microhistories in the ground.
I know some of your ancestors were involved in what was called the Battle of Batoche. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yes, you are.
Could you tell us what the Battle of Batoche was and why it is so important to Métis-Cree history?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. After 1870, the western provinces of Canada were freed up. The Hudson's Bay Company, this is used to own like all that land out in the west. And so London wasn't yielding a profit. Hudson's Bay was run out of London anymore. And so they wanted to divest themselves of the interest, and they sold it to Canada without consultation with the indigenous people that lived there. And so my family, being the most powerful bison traders on the plains, stood up against imperialism and said, you can't do that. You have to talk with us. And we won the first fight in 1870 in a place called Red River. And Canada kept expanding and pushed us out. And so we left what's called Winnipeg, and we went to a place called Batoche to recapture some of our lost ways of life and freedom. And we were successful for about a decade. And by 1885, Canada had again, with the aid of the British, they expanded into Saskatchewan. And so we knew what happened the first time and how they never honored their promises to us. And we stood up and went to war. And we were defeated thoroughly the second time around, because the railway was already completed and they could logistically send soldiers and police out, the Northwest Mounted Police. And so in this loss, we lost our sovereignty. We lost our ability to protect the bison. The bison were then destroyed. And our kin groups were scattered. The government came and actually attacked our domiciles to split up our families and our clans. And in that, we went from the very top trader class to the very lowest. We're called half-breeds or Michif. And we were even below Native First Nations people, because we didn't have the protection of the government. And they did this purposefully. They wanted to eradicate us as a military and an economic threat to the state. And so that's who we are. And just a little bit of Irish history kind of weaved in there. There was connections with the Fenians because we used to fight. They saw that our struggle against British imperialism was kind of parallel to theirs, and so we're almost countrymen in a lot of ways, I guess. Irish and Métis, you know.
So that would have been around the time the Battle of Ridgeway.
Yeah, around that time. That's yeah.
So when you discovered this, Jesse, what did it feel like inside in terms of piecing things together internally?
Oh, it gave me all the pieces. It just everything made perfect sense. Like I saw such dysfunction, alcoholism, misogyny, abandonment, all these things in my family history, which made me very resentful and actually drove my addictions, my own response to trauma. And so when I look back at my family history and I said, oh, look, my grandparents and their generation before that, they endured this, the absolute marginalization. So of course they're dysfunctional. And that of course is going to affect my mom and my father and like the way that they acted. And so when I saw this line of dysfunction, I came to forgive my parents for letting me and my brothers go, because their actions actually made sense in that context of why they did what they did, because of the marginalization was so severe, and actually came to forgive them like in a deep level, because when you understand people and their motivations, it's hard to stay mad at them, right? You really just understand what makes them tick. And it gave me the keys to also why I have a lot of this dysfunction that I have to work on in myself today. And so I would say it's the great clarifier. It's clarified my vision back that way. And it's given me a good orientation towards the future. Hopefully I can be a good father and that line of trauma ends with me. You know?
So could we talk about what the topic is for your research that's going towards your PhD?
So after the Battle of Batoche that we just talked about, the government started dividing up the prairies into square lot homesteads, they're called, and they would give these away to settlers. Part of the deal that the government gave the settlers that came to take our land was that they had to put improvements on it, so build farms and, you know, ranches and whatnot. Well, the way that they did it's called the Dominion Land Survey. It looks like a gigantic checkerboard, the prairie, even if you fly over it today. Well, in between those square lot homesteads, there were public strips of land, an allotment for infrastructure is what it is, for either railways or roads, communication lines, an allowance. So that they're called road allowances. And so this is crown land that nobody owns, right? And because the Métis were stripped of their land, we weren't allowed to own homesteads. We looked like we were native, so we couldn't participate in the market economy. We couldn't get bank loans. The only place for us to live were in these public strips of land as squatters, because we were out of the way. And so I want to study how these makeshift communities, mine in particular, Park Valley, formed after 1885, how they reached kind of a florescence in the 1930s and 40s, and then how they dissolved through policy in the 60s and 70s. And if you look at my book, one of the very beginning chapters, I show you what it actually looks like to live on a road allowance with my mushum and cookum. And so that's what I'm going to be studying. And this is hopefully going to add to the canon of historical literature in Western Canada.
And as part of your career now in York University,
yes.
You teach on Introduction to Indigenous Studies. Can you tell us about, first of all, about what that experience is like, departing the knowledge that you have to other people, and what you see in your students, you know, in terms of their understanding?
Yeah, so a lot of students come, I guess there's a romantic curiosity about Indigenous people. So they come thinking that it's about feathers and beads and buckskins and all that stuff, like everybody does, right? And I open their eyes to the policy and what actually happened here in Canada. And so for settlers, which I like to call guests, there's a real kind of awakening, a reckoning with the history that they've been told. I'm peeling back the veil and showing the process of nation state building. Some of them really enjoy it. Some of them are, shocked by what they're hearing. But in that same vein, I also see other Indigenous kids come into the classroom like I was all those years ago, who don't know who they are, whose families have been disrupted, who don't have a sense of their culture or worldview. And in my class, I get to introduce them to that, as well as to their ancestors and their ancestors' struggle. And in that, that's the most beautiful thing, to watch people meet their ancestors and understand their family history and themselves. And so in that way, I guess I'm paying back what Dr. Podruchny did for me, and that's the healthiest kind of transmission of knowledge dissemination that I can think of, is to pay it forward to the next generation. So,
you've mentioned the 60 Scoop and, what it's like today. You've said that there's more of it goes on today than in that period. Is there a sense that Indigenous history now, among the general public in Canada, it's much more well known now, or is it still under the radar?
Well, since 2014, I would say there's like a general understanding of the history because it's being taught at younger and younger grades. So the younger folks actually know more than the older folks in Canada, and that's a beautiful thing. Right. I can remember going through school and just not hearing anything about that. And so we're at a fulcrum point where we're going to reach critical mass, where people are going to know more and more about that history. But there's a long ways to go. I don't want to wear rose-colored glasses or your viewers to think that things are all hunky-dory. There's a long way of educating here. And there's a lot of people that don't want to hear what's happened, and they're trying to put blinders on. And so that's my job as a historian, is to, show the history as it was, and hopefully we can reconcile and move forward as a nation.
And your book has been out for quite a while now, but I was told that it's being launched in UK and Ireland pretty soon. Can you give us the details of that, your book, and where people can get it?
Major outlets will have it, as well as, I guess, Amazon.uk. You can pick up a copy there. And it's set soon, June, to storm the US, and we'll see how it does down there. But the story is really universal. I'm sure that you'll see a lot of trends that happened within my family, within the Irish family or the Scottish family. Anyone who's been touched by colonialism, there's veins of that running through my story.
Thanks, Jesse. I think that, the themes around transgenerational trauma, as you point out, different people from different countries will understand that. I think it's a really, really fascinating story, and I'm really glad that you came to tell us about it today. And best of luck with the PhD going forward. I'm sure it's going to be a success, and you're going to have two major publications on your hand. That's not bad going. So Jesse, thanks very much for taking the time to speak to me today.
Thank you so much, Barry. It's been an honor, and I can't wait to meet everyone in person when COVID comes up. I hope you guys have an invite for Ireland for me in my inbox. I'll watch for it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jesse.
Take care.